Next, let's talk about thermoregulation. We've alluded to it multiple times. Skin has multiple roles in thermoregulation. Sweating, hair, fat, blood vessels. These are all ways that humans, at least, can control thermoregulation. Thermoregulation varies among the species, and especially among different groups. So, for example, mammals regulate completely differently than birds, which are different than reptiles and insects. First, cold-blooded versus hot-blooded. Some even don't regulate, like for example, reptiles. But even among hot-blooded animals, it varies greatly. Like some like birds don't have hair; they have feathers, so they can't use hair. Certain animals have different compositions of fat. They have different sizes, so blood vessels may not be close to their body, or they may be actually closer to their body. So like some worms maybe could use blood vessels more, or insects actually use blood vessels a little bit more. And we'll talk about sweating. Not every animal sweats, even among mammals. Some animals don't sweat. It's actually what we're going to talk about right now. So sweating is one of the main ways humans cool the body off to prevent overheating. Humans release water from sweat glands in the dermis layer, along mixed in with some, some sodium and other minerals in it as well, but mostly it's just water. Water is a very good conductor of heat, meaning that heat travels very well through water. So the sweat absorbs the heat from the body in order to evaporate. So you essentially cover yourself in water, and then that water draws in the heat from inside your body, and when it gets heated enough, it'll evaporate, right? But mainly until it evaporates, it's constantly absorbing the heat from your body, and so the heat's not in your body, it's now going out. And by absorbing the heat, it lowers the temperature of the body and sends it into the atmosphere when it evaporates. Sorry about that. Other than humans and apes, very few animals actually sweat. Cats and dogs sweat a little bit through their paws, like the tips of their paws, like over here. But mainly they actually use panting and release heat through the water on their tongue. So it's a very similar idea, except they do it through the mouth, specifically through their tongue, where they release water onto their tongue, and then their tongue absorbs the heat from their body and then evaporates. And this is what makes specifically the ability to sweat and sweat a lot. So it makes humans, apes, horses great endurance runners, especially humans, compared to other animals like dogs and cats. They can't really run for a very long time. So even though a dog or a cat is very fast, they don't tell you that they actually end up having to stop very rapidly. They can't keep running for a long time because they start to overheat and they have to stop to pant because they can't pant while running, whereas we can sweat while running. They have to stop and they have to pant and kind of cool off before they can continue again. If not, they'll overheat. Okay. Next up is hair and fat. Hair and fat, both very important for insulation to prevent hypothermia. So sweat is to cool off when it's really hot. Hair and fat mostly used to warm up when it's cold. The natural flow of heat is always from hot to cold, but these insulators have a lot of resistance for heat transfer and prevent it from leaving the body when it's cold outside. So when it's cold outside, normally if you had no fat, no hair, essentially the heat would just go down its gradient from your hot body, which is 98 degrees, to the cold outside, which is much less, like 20 degrees or 30 degrees, or however many degrees it is outside. And it would essentially leave your body and you would freeze to death because all the temperature and all the heat would leave your body and it would go to the outside, and so your body would be too cold. What happens is this hair and this fat, it acts as an insulator. It doesn't let the heat, even though the gradient is still there, it increases the resistance and prevents as much heat from going through. Basically makes it really hard for the heat to move, right? The heat wants to move because there's a gradient, but it can't move because it's physically very hard for it because there's hair and fat in the way. In addition to the insulative properties of fat, brown fat is especially good for thermoregulation when it's cold. When white fat, which is what mostly you have in your body, white fat is burned, it mainly provides a lot of energy with a little bit of heat, which is usually what we want, because that's the purpose of fat. It's energy storage. So when you burn it, you want to make a lot of energy and you don't really want to have heat. Brown fat is inefficient combustion, meaning that when it gets burned by the body, it produces very little energy, but a lot of heat, because all of the energy is leaving in the form of heat. So it's energy we can't use by the body. But when it's cold outside, obviously you don't care about energy, you want to make some heat. So brown fat's good when it's really cold outside, you can burn it and get a lot of heat. Adults have a relatively low amount of brown fat compared to white fat, but infants and like very young children, they have a lot more brown fat as they rely more on it for heating than adults. Because like we mentioned with like shivering and other things, kids don't really have, like infants don't really have as much of that, so they rely more on brown fat. Okay, next up, let's talk about blood vessels and thermoregulation. So there's vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Vasoconstriction is the narrowing of blood vessels, which occurs when it's cold outside to prevent hypothermia, similar to the hair and fat. Obviously, the amount of heat transfer is inversely proportional to the distance between the transfer points. So if you had a temperature gradient, say my body and the window over there, and it's cold outside, obviously the heat from my body is not really going to go to the window outside. One, because there's obviously like a lot of insulation between there, especially in the air. But in addition, it's also because it's like very difficult to go a long distance. So increasing distance will reduce the heat transfer. That's essentially what vasoconstriction does. So imagine this is your skin. Let me draw in purple. So you have purple skin, say, then you have these red blood vessels, right? And it's a tube. And this is the outside world. It's cold. This is like the air, yes. And it's cold outside. So the heat, which I'll draw in black, is going from here to here, right? It's cold outside, so the heat is going this way. What vasoconstriction does is, so still you have your purple skin, and then your blood vessels now, they decrease in size. So now they are much thinner, like this. Okay, and it's now again going from here to here, right? But look, the distance from here to here is now greater than the distance from here to here, right? You can see that this is bigger than this, right? So this distance is a lot more because it got constricted. So it used to be like this, now it's like this. So it means it has less distance to the outside, or more distance to the outside, sorry. Meaning that because there's more distance, less heat transfer. Vasodilation is the opposite. Vasodilation is the widening, and it's used when it's hot outside because you want to increase heat transfer. Again, purple skin, red. Again, you want to go from here to here, right? But when vasodilation occurs, you have this, it widens, becomes a lot thicker. This is like obviously a much more extreme example, but like just showing you, thickens, gets wider, less distance, more heat transfer to the outside world. Because again, heat gradient is going from inside your body to outside. Vasoconstriction, in addition to being, so in addition to what I mentioned where it increases distance to the outside world, vasoconstriction also reduces your blood flow to the appendages, so your fingers, your feet, your toes, things like that, in order to keep the core warmer, right? Because if it goes to your fingers, if like the blood, which has most of the heat, will go through your hands, arms, it'll go to your fingers, and it'll just go right out from your fingers to the outside world. It's very easy. Whereas if you instead heat, blood goes from here to your arm, right here, then it stops at your like wrist, and then it actually transfers the heat back through the artery, back through the vein, sorry. It goes through the artery, and then it travels back through the vein, goes back, and then back to your core. The heat doesn't go to your fingers, which is why your fingers feel very cold, but that's because if it was to go to your fingers, it would just go right out. Your whole body would get colder. Whereas now, your middle part is still same warmth, but your fingers are just not getting the blood flow So because they're not allowing you to go out, staying right here, centered essentially. And what that does is that makes your fingers and feet and toes feel very cold, and those are the first things that feel cold, but your core in exchange gets to keep being warm, right? And with vasodilation, again, it does the opposite, so it can increase blood flow, and actually vasodilation also can lower blood pressure, right? Because if the blood vessels are wider, obviously less pressure. So vasodilation can also lower blood pressure, and vasodilator medications can also be commonly prescribed for high blood pressure. That's another use of, I guess, vasodilation other than thermoregulation. It can also be used, and it is medically used for high blood pressure.